excuse my daughter in the background. We're in Canada, so we still have a virtual school. But it's a real honor to introduce Rav Yonah Reiss. Rav Reiss is the Beis Din of the CRC, the Chicago Rabbinical Council, and a Dayan of the Beis Din of America. As well, Rav Reiss is a Rosh Yeshiva at Reiss and its former dean. And he served as the director of the Beis Din of America from 1998 to 2008. Thank you so much for making some time today. And please, Rav Reiss. Thank you.
Hey, thank you very much. This shir is in memory and in tribute to Rav Gedaliah Dov Schwartz, Zefer Tzadik Levracha, who, as we all know, was the Beis Din of the Beit Din of America, the Rosh Beit Din of the Chicago Rabbinical Council. I had the privilege of working with Rabbi Schwartz for well over 20 years and being able to benefit from his wisdom, his guidance, and his example. In the upcoming week's parsha, we speak about Moshe Rabbeinu and his leadership. And Moshe Rabbeinu says, did I give birth to these people to have to deal with all of their complaints and with all of their difficulties? That I have to carry these people the way that a mother would carry her nursing child. And Rashi comments, so where was Moshe Rabbeinu commanded to take upon himself this degree of responsibility that now he seems to be complaining about it? It was back in Parshas Ve'era when he was chosen to be a leader of the people, Vayitzavema b'nei Yisrael, Tziba Aleim manhigam benachas v'lisbolosam. That to be a leader means that he was commanded to deal gently with the people, regardless of any of their grievances and complaints and various other vicissitudes. To be patient with them, to put up with them. And Rashi goes further and he says, in fact, that when you're appointed to be a leader the way Moshe Rabbeinu was appointed, it's even on condition. The leadership is accepted on condition that the people are going to give you a hard time. Sometimes they're going to criticize you. Sometimes they're even going to curse at you. But this is part of what the responsibility of Jewish leadership entails. And this, in fact, is very much something that Rav Schwartz took to heart. He was not afraid of taking a courageous stand when it came to various issues, when it came to issuing various psakim. But he had to have a lot of patience and a lot of forbearance because sometimes it was very lonely at the top. Sometimes he received a lot of criticism. Sometimes the people were very harsh against him. And he also had to be terribly patient because he would have people come and ask him questions and take up a tremendous amount of his time. And they weren't always easy, but Rav Schwartz always had tremendous patience and forbearance and sensitivity towards everybody. And this, I think, is an important model for all of us to recognize that we are supposed to emulate in terms of what Jewish leadership means. It means that you're not in it for the kavod, as I'm sure all of you have discovered by now, but it even means on some level you are in it for the bizyonos, that it's Amenas Cain, that this is a job that sometimes requires you to deal with, as the Medrash says, people that can be savanim, ragzanim, talchonim, who can, give you a very, very hard time and make life very, very difficult for you and even have a bad temper. Certainly that was true of people going through emotionally difficult times when they come to the Beis Din for a get or in the middle of a din Torah or something like that. But you have to be very, very forbearing. I remember my early days in the Beis Din when there was a case referred to me by Rabbi Leibish Landesman, Shlita from the Muncie of Beis Din, Kol HaRabbanim, a difficult divorce case with a husband who was not an easy character, and he felt that it would be better, for whatever reason, for our Beis Din to deal with the case, and I appreciated the referral. And then I proceeded to call up the husband, and boy, did he hurl invectives and bizyonis against me, and I was all upset. I was in my junior years, working in the world of Beis Din. I called up Rabbi Landis and I said, "What did you do to me? You set this fellow upon me just to hurl curses in my direction. What kind of a favor are you doing me by referring this case to me?" So Rabbi Landesman laughed and he said, the Gemara in Baba Basra says about Eov that he said really harsh things towards the Kadosh Baruch Hu when he was suffering. But the Gemara says there ain't adam nispas b'shas tzaraso. A person is not held accountable for the things that he says when things are going difficult. You have to understand when you're dealing with these cases, people are going through emotionally turbulent times. And I learned an important lesson, and I learned that so many, many times exponentially over the years with Rabbi Schwartz, the tremendous patience that he had towards people, maybe recognizing that if they were turning to him in the first place, they were going through difficult times. The other principle that he operated off of was what the Rambam says in Hilchos Sanhedrin, that one of the paramount responsibilities of a dayan is a hatzil oshuk miaroshko, that you should try to help out the vulnerable and the defenseless in the society, those who don't have others to protect them. And I think that's one of the reasons why why Rav Schwartz was particularly sensitive to women who were going through aguna situations, because there the word ashuk is actually used in the Tshuva Sabach. Somebody was writing to the Bach about an aguna situation, quoted from the Pasuk in Koheles, that the agunos are people who are being oppressed. There's no one to comfort them, but to help them out. So Schwartz felt a special need and obligation to really exert himself in order to help agunot. And he felt that koach teira adif, that if you can issue a heter, then you have a responsibility to do so. But Schwartz at the same time also felt koach the heter adif. You need the koach to engage in hetera. Schwartz had that koach. He was an unbelievable masmin, unbelievable baki in all of the Tachumei HaTorah that he knew inside out. It was only with that koach and to know the Gemaras, the Rishonim, the Achronim, the Poskim, that enabled him to really know when it was appropriate to institute a heter in a particular case. When he came to Illinois, it was in the late 1980s. One of the first cases he dealt with was the Goldman divorce case. It was the Goldman divorce case. It's a case that's described in the Illinois courts, where there was a recalcitrant husband who didn't want to give his wife a get. And people know there's a published court case in Illinois that they brought in rabbis to testify as to whether the Jewish law required the husband to automatically give his wife a get when there's going to be a dissolution of the marriage. The argument centered around the fact that there was a ksuba. There was a signed marriage contract that said that Kedas Moshe Yisrael, they're entering into the marriage according to laws of Moses in Israel. So Rabbi Schwartz, what did he testify? Yeah, Kedas Moshe Yisrael means that if the marriage becomes unwound, the husband has to give his wife a get. And they wanted the Illinois court to paskin that the husband's obligated to give his wife a get. Interestingly, the other rabbi who testified in that case was none other than Rabbi Emanuel Rackman. So they didn't always agree on everything, but they agreed in this one case that the husband was obligated to give his wife a get. But Schwartz felt that this particular case, based on the circumstances of the case, warranted the application of the Mishnah in Gittin and Daf Peiches Amud Beis, which says you can utilize the secular courts to compel a husband to give a get, aseh ma sheyisrael omrim lecha, if it is in fact consonant with the psak of the Beis Din. Schwartz, as the new Beis Din of the Chicago Rabbinical Council, was empowered to paskin this was such a case where the husband was obligated to give a get, and that it was appropriate to utilize the court system to require the get to be given based on his psak. So what ended up happening, we see the power of Schwartz from this story, really remarkable, is that Tzaddik goes there, HaKadosh Baruch Hu Mekayim. Schwartz said a get has to be given, this marriage has to be ended. So when the court handed down its judgment, the husband, according to those who were present and testified about it, the husband turned to his wife and he said, yeah, you think that because the court ordered me to give a get, I'll give you a get. I'll tell you what, I'll give you a get over my dead body. 2 weeks later, he dropped dead. So the wife became an almana. She was allowed to remarry on that basis. Rabbi Schwartz's psakim had tremendous force. That's all I can tell you. There's a question whether the hachakos Rabbeinu Tam that are sometimes instituted in get cases are considered to be coercive. What are hachakos Rabbeinu Tam? There was a machlokes between the Rambam and Rabbeinu Tam about if a wife says that her husband is mois alive, that he's repulsive to her, whether we can coerce a get. That was the Rambam's opinion, or whether, no, you can't coerce a get. That is the Rabbeinu Tam's opinion. We paskin like a Rabbeinu Tam, that it's not automatic that you can coerce a get because the wife finds the husband repulsive. But Rabbeinu Tam said you can't coerce a get but you can apply distancing measures. That's what we call a chokos d'Rabbeinu tam. That the rabbis in town can say, you're not going to do business with this fellow. You're not going to give this fellow honors. You're not going to seat him in a seat in shul, or call him up for aliyos, so invite him to your bar mitzvahs or your weddings. All of those steps are allowed to be taken to demonstrate that the man is not in good standing. It's the withholding of benefits as opposed to the imposition of penalties. And if a man on that basis decides to give a get, it's not going to be considered to be a coerced get. It's going to be a valid get. So the Vilna Gaon in the Shulchan Aruch, Simon Kuf Nundal and Even Ezer asks, why is that not considered to be coercive? The Vilna Gaon explains, because because if one town decides it's going to enact these measures against the husband, he can always go to another town. This is true certainly Bisman Azeh. Whenever there are such measures that are instituted against the recalcitrant husband, he can always find a shtibel somewhere that's going to hold him to be in good standing. He can always run away somewhere. So Rav Schwartz took this principle a step further. It's the case here in the Chicago Rabbinical Council. The husband came in for a get, and of course the first question you ask is this get being given by you of your own free will? The husband said, I'm only giving the get because the court threatened to hold me in contempt. If I don't give the get, they're going to throw me in jail if I don't give the get. You know, they're very tough here in Illinois. So that's the only reason. It's really a coerced get. So Rabbi Schwartz, not missing a beat, turned to the husband and he said, wait a second. Is the court going to have jurisdiction upon you if you go to Indiana, which is only about 30 miles away to the east? So the fellow said, no. So Rabbi Schwartz said, so technically you can go to Indiana and then they won't be able to hold you in contempt. They won't be able to throw you into jail. Is that correct? We said, yeah, that's correct. So Rabbi Schwartz said, okay, you have a choice. You can go to Indiana. I'm not requiring you to do this. Go to Indiana right now. But if you choose not to go to Indiana and you want to give a get because you're not interested in going to Indiana, so that's your own free choice. So the man gave a get, and Rabbi Schwartz held that based on this principle of the Vilna Gaon, that was a perfectly valid get. Rabbi Schwartz always had this balance between the Hatzel Ashik Miyad Oshko. The mandate, as the Rambam says, that you're supposed to save a defenseless person from being oppressed, but he also balanced that with Lo Saguim Pnei Ish. You also can't be afraid of anybody. You can't be fearful of anybody. The proof text that the Rambam brings about the notion that one of the Dayan's imperatives is the Hatzel Ashik Miyad Oshko is V'yaka Moshe V'Yoshian with respect to the Benos Yisrael. When Moshe Rabbeinu saw that they were being bullied by the other shepherds in terms of not being able to fill up water from the well, so Moshe got up and saved them. So it's very interesting that it's not just the Yoshian, that Moshe took the appropriate measures in order to save the Benos Yisrael. It was V'yakam Moshe V'Yoshian. He got up. He was proactive. But Schwartz felt that a Dayan also has to be proactive. You have to be proactive in terms of figuring out what are the steps that you need to take, the affirmative steps to be strong in different cases and to protect the vulnerable in society in terms of promoting things such as the halakhic prenuptial agreement, which he felt very strong about. He also was a supporter of the organization of ORA. He gave his official written support. You look on their website, that Rav Schwartz felt that the organization of resolution of Agunot. I was involved with the founding around 20 years ago, which operates under halakhic auspices in terms of taking proper measures when a bezdin has ruled that a husband is a recalcitrant in order to influence the husband to come in front of the bezdin or to give a get, as the case may be, that this is an appropriate organization in terms of really serving as an enforcement arm of the Bati Din, because after all, the Torah says, Shoftim is Shotrim, it's not enough just to have the Dayanim. The Dayanim have to have Shotrim, they have to have police, they have to have an enforcement arm. That's why it was always important to Schwartz that we write our decisions in the Bezdin in a way that it could be enforced in a civil court, that they could serve as our enforcement arm, just as in the Goldman case. And so too with respect to Gittin. If the Bezdin ruled the husband is recalcitrant, there should be organizations that engage in protests and demonstrations under appropriate halakhic auspices and under appropriate legal auspices. I worry a little bit with the advent of the Instagram influencers that have become prominent in the past several months and the like of putting in pressure on the recalcitrant husbands through the internet and through Instagram and so forth. That it is a little worrisome if it's not going to be under rabbinic auspices, because Schwartz felt that all of these types of measures are appropriate when they're operating as the shotrim. The shotrim are the police officers of the Beis Din. They have to know what are the parameters of when it's time to act, when there's due process, what types of measures are appropriate. Rabbi Landesman Shlita wrote a tshuva just a month or so ago, in which he said that he worried that if these things are being done in ways that are not under rabbinic auspices, that it's possible that he heard of stories that a husband's so worried about an angry mob outside that he's going to give the get based on Shema Yaharguni Halmon, that he's worried that maybe they're going to kill me. When you have Ora, so there isn't that sense of fear that the Ora people who are from let's say the YU world operating under the auspices of Rosh Hashanah Shlita, that they're not going to take such harsh measures. They understand the boundaries, so you don't have to worry that the get is going to be invalid. It's very, very important that these types of measures be done under the proper rabbinic auspices. I always say this is the classic Batman versus Gotham City dilemma, that the Batman has to work together with the commissioner. The same thing is true, in the Beis Din world, the demonstrators have to work together with the Batei Din. It's a whole hullabaloo that we're familiar with regarding the parameters of the Psak of Kiddushay Tos. So Moshe Feinstein published a few tshuvos in which he said that if there was a fatal flaw at the time of a marriage, that if a woman would have known that her husband had this flaw, no woman would have married a man with such a flaw. The information existed at the time of the marriage. It was withheld from the wife, and as soon as she found out about the flaw, she immediately wanted out of the marriage. You have all of those criteria in place that when you do have such an egregious situation and the husband is otherwise refusing to give a get, then you could be matir a woman without a get. And you had certain Batei Din that were not as trained, shall we say, as Rabbi Schwartz, that took this further than Rabbi Schwartz felt was appropriate, and he spoke out when he felt that this heter was being exploited inappropriately. At the same time, Rav Schwartz felt that there certainly were occasions when this was appropriate. It's very interesting. Here in the Chicago Rabbinical Council, we actually have posted on the wall of the courtroom of the Chicago Rabbinical Council that was dedicated in memory of Rabbi Schwartz. We have a couple of letters of Kisvei Yad from very distinguished Rabbanim, including the Ridvaz, who was here in Chicago for a couple of years at the turn of the beginning of the 20th century. And there's also a letter from the Panovich Rav, from the Zecher Yitzchak, from Yitzchak Yaakov Rabinovich. It's a letter to the rabbis of Chicago from 1905. It says, Rabbanim Gedolim Be'er Chicago v'yodim b'zeh Ka'isha, gives the name Leah Basur Chaim, that this particular woman, Hitarnu also, we in Panovich, I put together a Beis Din in Panovich in order to permit her to remarry. Hitarnu also Linase Acharei Kabbalas Eidus, after we had accepted testimony, Shibolanu, Kehayu that the husband had Simane Shtus, that we received testimony that he was a Meshugana, Ad Terem Hakidushin, even before they got married, and she wasn't aware of that information. And on this basis, we permitted her to remarry. So we find that there were matirim. There were Rabbanim who questioned the heter. It's not obvious. It's not even obvious. Then in the other direction, if there was something terribly wrong with the woman, that a husband would be able to divorce her without a get. It's a chiddush of Tosfos. Yavama stop base on the base. If there's a very, very serious flaw, like an islandist, and even a get, midrabanan wouldn't be necessary. It's a machlokes amongst the various shitas, rishonim, achronim, whether you can apply that to egregious situations where there's a fatal flaw in the husband, or whether you say tav l'mesav tandu l'mesav amalu. But Moshe Feinstein felt that there was more of a basis to be matir in the case of a woman, because a man always figures he has an out. He can, in an extreme situation, we'll allow him to give a get to his wife, al-korcho. We can allow a head to Meir Rabbanim. A woman has no out whatsoever. So therefore, she's less likely to tolerate a very, very extreme flaws. Very extreme flaw. So there is room to be mako. So one of the first cases that we dealt with when I was at the Beis Din of America was with a man who was refusing to give his wife a get. And it emerged from very compelling evidence that he had been a homosexual, an active homosexual, not only during marriage, but before marriage. And Rav Moshe has a tshuva saying that no woman would want to be married to a man who's not interested in having relations with a woman, but only interested in having relations with a man. The intimate relationship of the marriage is essential and intrinsic to the marriage. That's why Rav Moshe was also making in a case where the man had no gruas anoshim. wasn't capable of having relations. That unless she says otherwise, it's presumed no woman wants to enter into a marriage of that sort. And my job was to write up the shaila for Rav Schwartz on which he would paskin this issue, and Rav Schwartz felt comfortable paskening. This was right out of Moshe's textbook, so to speak. And then eventually it emerged that the tshuva made its way to the circles of the Rabbanut in Eretz Yisrael, and they were mekabel that tshuva. But other than that, one case, it was really a very, very rare occurrence that we would have a situation where there would be enough of a basis to be mako. Before Rav Schwartz's stroke, we were working on a case. The fellow had a very bad case of bipolar disorder, which the wife knew about in part, but she thought that he was taking medication. It turned out he wasn't really ever taking proper medication. She didn't know just how badly he behaved before the marriage. After the marriage, he was running naked through the streets, through a highway. And Rav Schwartz felt that there was a basis here, but it was more questionable because bipolar disorder is something a person can get married. It can be controlled with proper medication and so forth. I turned at the time to Rav Shlomo Amar. We agreed that we would go to one of the outside authorities, also somebody who had tremendous respect for Rav Schwartz. But Amar was nervous about this case. He felt that it didn't necessarily satisfy the criteria, a whole machlokes altogether, how much to apply Kedushin Tos. What was interesting is that after Rav Schwartz's stroke, he wasn't able to come back to the office afterwards. But his mind was still very functional. He wasn't able to talk with the same robust voice, but you could still understand him. He could still talk. The conversations were shorter. But the first thing he asked me, the first visit that I made to Rav Schwartz after his stroke is, I won't say the real name of the person. Let's say the person's name, the woman's name was Kessler. So he said to me, "What's doing with the Kessler case?" That was the first thing out of his mouth, because this was his sensitivity. He was always thinking of other people before he was thinking of himself. But whenever there was a heter, I inherited some of the files that he was working on and that he issued shuvas upon. So Schwartz always had very, very extensive notes, very extensive records. No heter was issued without a very, very careful drisha v'chakira, a very careful shakla v'tarya. Because one thing that a dayan has to do also is to be able to identify issues. We have to identify those issues that have to be overcome. We had a case this past year. I was in the middle of doing a get, and suddenly I see that there's a little child that runs into the bezdin when we're doing the get. So I said to the husband and wife were both there. I said, "Oh, is that your child? I'm only married for a couple of years." So he said, "No, that's my wife's child from another man." According to the information we were given, the wife was not previously married. So I said, I guess she had maybe sometimes a person has an out of wedlock liaison and it is just a one-time thing. So clearly I wouldn't require again. I said, yeah, she has two children from this other man. So I said, the other man's Jewish? Yeah, the other man's Jewish. We did Drisha v'Chakira. It turned out that there was a wedding performed for her, despite the fact that she had two children from another Jewish man, because there had never been a chuppah v'kiddushin. And we had to do our homework to see to it that there be a proper investigation if it wasn't done before. Not casting aspersions on anyone, but this type of thing obviously does have to be investigated. So we had to make sure that there was a proper investigation of the circumstances, so that there not be any question with respect to the wife's ability to remarry in the future. Schwartz always had this in the file. If there was some sort of a question, a person was previously married and was no get, there'd be a note in the file that he said, I investigated this, badakti, darashti, v'kakarti, b'davazev, isha, muteris, b'litzach, get, mibayla harishon, mitam, blank and blank, and he would give the reasoning. So it'd be an Adam Gadol, a Gavra Rabba that looked into the matter. People wouldn't think of looking into it themselves. He always made sure to cover the tracks because he understood that he had a responsibility towards everybody who came in front of him. One of the big issues is with respect to Heter Me'er Rabbanim. Schwartz wrote an article in the Journal of Halacha and Contemporary Society around the time he became the Bezdin of the Chicago Rabbinical Council, going back to the late 1980s, about how you have to be very careful with Heter Me'er Rabbanim. When Rabbeinu Gershom issued his takana, a man can't be married more than one wife. So part of the takana was that there would be an escape hatch. That if there was a situation where it wasn't possible really to give a get to the first wife, but where it was warranted for the man to be able to marry another wife, if 100 rabbis would agree, then the restriction of Rabbeinu Gershom would not be applicable. So this institution of Het Tamei Rabbanim has unfortunately been abused over the years, where there's a wife who's ready, willing, and able to receive a get, but somebody decides, no, she doesn't deserve one. We'll give a Het Tamei Rabbanim for the man to remarry. So this is a terrible thing. Because part of the heter is that a woman who's prepared to receive a get certainly should be entitled to receive a get before the husband should remarry. But Moshe Feinstein wrote a tshuva in the Igros Moshe, and when she says in Ekvam, even if you're dealing with a rebellious woman who dafka be'shloshes get kosher, it's only if you set aside a kosher get, a shebachos man shetirtza yishul lekabel get tukol avo lekabel a get. If that is unconditionally available for the woman, for the Yos Muteres Liyama, so she can be free to remarry somebody else. Even if the husband has monetary claims or other claims against the wife, nonetheless, if a heter is going to be issued to the husband, there has to be an unconditional get made available for the wife at any time, a valid get. And we got a number of Rabbanim together throughout North America to sign a document which says that this is our official policy here in North America. No man should ever be allowed to remarry, regardless of what behavior a rabbi or bezdin wants to claim that the wife was guilty of. She ran to secular court, whatever it was, it doesn't matter. The husband can't be given a heter to remarry unless it's an unconditional get set aside for the wife. This is one document. But Schwartz didn't sign too much after his stroke. But when I put this document in front of him and I explained to him what we put together, all the dayanim throughout, North America, we have these annual conferences. Rabbi Schwartz picked up his pen and with great concentration, great focus, he affixed his signature on that document. Because things that are going to be a takana for Klal Yisrael, this was very, very important to him. There was a takana that we made at the Bezdin of America, because what happened once was that there was a Bezdin that issued a seir against the woman for refusing to come to Bezdin when her husband wanted to adjudicate the divorce in Bezdin, but the get wasn't given yet. They just issued a seir against the woman. So some well-meaning rabbi thought, there's a seir against the woman. I guess that means that I would be permitted to allow for the remarriage of the husband, despite the fact that he's not giving his wife a get. He put a get at escrow and said, yeah, when she comes out of secular court, so then the get can be delivered. And this rabbi thought that it was okay. So I sent a letter to him at the time saying, this is against the psak of a Moshe Feinstein. This is against the practice of all the Rabbanim in North America. I didn't have everybody's signatures yet, but I felt comfortable saying that. This was a case in California. So I sent the letter to all of the major rabbis and Bezdin figures in California as well. And it put pressure that the rabbi realized, no, I probably shouldn't have allowed this. And he went to the husband and said, I made a mistake. You have to make sure that the get is given to your wife right away. It's very interesting. You think that it doesn't help to circulate such letters and takanos and pronouncements, because whoever does these things, they're not going to listen anyway. It's not true. Sometimes people just don't know better. I met this rabbi who had allowed the wedding at a chasida sometime later, and the rabbi came over to me and he said, I just want to thank you for that letter that you sent out. It enabled me to see the light. I didn't realize that it was against a Moshe, that it was against the official policy of all the poskim. As soon as I realized that, I put the appropriate pressure on the husband to give his wife a get. So we enacted a policy. We said it's very dangerous for a bezdin to issue a seir against the wife, even if, let's say, she does the wrong thing halachically. She refuses to come to bezdin, and the husband wants to adjudicate the entire divorce in bezdin. Said this in principle. We just read about in last week's parsha. The husband also has to be free of sin. So the husband has to show that he's immaculate in terms of his own behavior. He wants a seir against his wife. Let him first give her a get. Gives a get, fine. Then it's like any choshen mishpah case. You summon somebody about a monetary dispute, they refuse to come, so you're entitled to have a seir issued against them. But first, make sure that you give the get. That's been the policy of the Bezdin of America for the past 20 years, and it's been a very effective policy. It's endorsed by Rabbi Schwartz, and I consulted at the time with Rav Tzvi Gartner, who's the author of the Sefer Kfiyah Beget, the official sefer under the auspices of Otzer Poskim about when are you allowed to exert pressure on a husband for giving a get, and when is it inappropriate? And I asked Rabbi Gartner, is this measure a good and appropriate measure? He said 100%. So we issued the measure, and it's been extremely helpful. Rabbi Schwartz was also ideally suited for gerus when it came to conversion matters in terms of his temperament. I learned the mechanisms of how to be a Mesider gerus from Rabbi Schwartz in terms of his sensitivity towards the conversion candidates. We just received a letter today from a recent conversion candidate who thanked the rabbis of the CRC. I give credit to Rabbi Abramson and the other dayanim of the CRC for their great sensitivity. And she wrote, ever since the conversion took place, she's been laughing and crying with joy every single day. It's just such a beautiful testament, and she thanked us for our sensitivity. This all came from Rabbi Schwartz. I said to some of my office mates after we got the letter, I said, this is Musar Haskell for all of us. Those of us who are privileged to be born Jewish, we should be laughing and crying with joy every single moment. Just like this person who feels that way, being entitled to enter Tachas Kanfei Ashri. Beautiful, beautiful letter. Schwartz followed the example of Hillel, that Hillel said, that it says in the Gemara in Shabbos, you should always be forbearing, like Hillel was forbearing, very, very kind and patient with conversion candidates. It's specifically in the context I'm sorry. It's specifically in the context of conversion candidates that the Gemara makes that statement with respect to Hillel. And Rabbi Schwartz always spoke very, very gently with every single conversion candidate and worked very closely with whatever issues that they might be sorting through in the most kind and understanding fashion. So he always asked 4 questions in the mikvah. Do you believe in one God? Do you reject all other religions? Do you believe in Schar V'Onesh? And then Rabbi Schwartz would hold up his finger in this very authoritative way, kind and authoritative at the same time, for those who knew Rabbi Schwartz, and he would say, and this is the most important question. Do you accept upon yourself without any reservation whatsoever all of the 613 commandments of the Torah? And I'm careful. I always repeat the question exactly the fashion of Rabbi Schwartz, a combination of trying to be authoritative, representing the Shekhinah and Klal Yisrael, but at the same time, very kind in terms of his delivery. Rabbi Schwartz also felt that you should make the bracha of Shechianu after a conversion candidate completes the immersion. Not everybody does this. It's based on the Tshuvas Radbaz. Radbaz says it's a great, happy occasion. Convert should feel happiness. That was the idea. You take them through a process where at the end of the day, they should feel very accomplished. They've accomplished a lot, but it should be with a sense of joy, not, the Bezdin took me, put me through such a rigmarole, now there's nothing left of me. Yeah, they should feel a satisfaction that the Bezdin made them work hard, but they should also feel a sense of joy and that they should want to make the bracha of Shechianu. Rabbi Schwartz also held by the position of he would call it Rav Hirsch Pesach Frank. He never called him Tzvi Pesach Frank. Hirsch Pesach Frank, like he knew him, personally. Or the Gedolim, he felt a personal connection to. Who paskin that if a convert already had a bris milah, a male convert had a bris milah for the sake of Jewishness because they thought he was Jewish and didn't realize that the mother wasn't Jewish or something, then you didn't need a hatavas dam bris afterwards, and that's always been our practice. But he held like Moshe Rosen. Moshe Rosen was one of the great Gedolei Poskim in America, of course, the Gedolei Poskim in America. He was the author of Nezer HaKodesh, and he said, but if the circumcision was not done by a frum moil, it was done by a Jewish moil, but the moil wasn't frum, so there's the opinion of the Ramah in Hilchos Milah that a mumar dino kegoy, and the bris milah of a goy is not good, so therefore that bris milah is not good either. And according to one opinion, when you have a bris milah from a goy, you have to do a hatafis dam bris afterwards, and he followed that opinion. So too he felt that when you have a non-frum moil, that then you should have a hatafis dam bris afterwards. But Moshe Rosen said, strictly speaking, you could be mako, the person's not an apostate. And people, you can argue are in the category of Tinov Shenishba, the non-frum oil also has a pride in his Jewishness on some level. But he said that as a policy matter, he thought that it would be dangerous to be Mekos, it should be Machmir. So Rav Schwartz was always Machmir. But if it was a child, under 13, you were doing a Geras Kotter, the child would be so squeamish to have a Hatzavis Dam Bris. He said, you could be Mako in that case. In that case, you could be Mako. They were always a combination of practical halacha with compassion, obviously compassion within the parameters of halacha. But the most important value to Rav Schwartz was the value of integrity. I was once working with Rav Schwartz on a Geras case where involved a guardianship, a complicated situation, where there was a young adult who didn't have full mental capacity, but at a certain measure mental capacity. It was the question whether the gerus could be performed under those circumstances. And we were given all kinds of medical information regarding this individual that came into us. And the medical information indicated the person couldn't get dressed by themselves. The person had zero mental capacity whatsoever. These were, official medical evaluations that were done. And it's a real question whether, with respect to somebody who, let's say, is in the category of Cheresh V'Shoite, the Torah quotes, Rabbeinu quotes the Bahag, saying that you can't really do a gerus in that type of situation. So so we got in touch with the Rabbanim who brought the issue to us. Nothing against anybody over here. The Rabbanim, I think, very legitimately answered. And they said, no, you have to understand those medical papers, they had to be skewed a certain way because they needed to get insurance assistance on behalf of the medical needs of this child. So therefore, they had to present things in the most extreme possible way, but it's not really true. It's not really true. So Rav Schwartz looked at me and he said, I can't deal with this. I can't deal with something that's not entirely true. I'm presented with a record and they're telling me that there's a falsehood and that the falsehood was somehow legitimate. I can't deal with it. Rav Schwartz, if there was anything that smelled of sheker whatsoever, he couldn't touch it. He couldn't touch it. He was allergic to falsehood or anything which smacked as having a lack of integrity. He was completely allergic to it. I think that's one of the reasons why Rav Schwartz personified Elokim Saba Das Kel Bekev Elokim Yishpot. That the Dayanim supposed to have the Shekhinah hovering over them. You really felt it with Rav Schwartz. Rav Schwartz entered into the room. You felt a kedusha in the room. Why would you feel that kedusha? So we know Chosama Shel Kadosh Baruch Hu Emes. He had that meter of Emes. The greater the Emes, the greater the kedusha. You could always feel that palpable sense of kedusha with Rav Schwartz. So just a few years ago, we had the shaila involving a semi-autistic child where the father was Jewish, had a child out of wedlock with a non-Jewish woman. And they had this child. The child was a young girl. The girl was not yet bat mitzvah, but she was a very low functionality. And I remember the first time we met with her, she wasn't really able to answer too much. She identified a menorah on the table. She said something like menorah, Hanukkah, like there was a little bit, but it was very, very limited. But at the same time, the father's entire life was to, be able to raise this girl, and it so pained him not to be able to raise her as Jewish. And the girl was living completely with him, not with a non-Jewish mother. The question whether we could be makel. On the one hand, the Torah and the Beis Yosef quoted the Baal Halachos Gedolos and Hilchos Gerim that you can't really do a gerus under those circumstances. But at the same time, the Torah points out that the Baal Halachos Gedolos also said you can't convert a katan. He said, well, the Gemara in Ksuvos, Kosar Puna, saying you can't convert a katan. The katan abilan also adas bestin. So it doesn't seem to go together. That he says you can't convert a katan, but yet you can convert a katan if the parents bring the child. So the Beis Yosef seems to indicate that, well, if you would have parental supervision, then it would be okay. But is that only applied to a katan, and that applied to the cheresh and shota part? Then he quotes from a separate shita of the Gaonim, which says that Rabbi Yehuda Gon said that if you have a young Eved, you have an Eved who's a cheresh or a shota, then the conversion could be done al pi avosav. It could be done through the parents, bringing such an Eved. So it seems so the Beis Yosef says that when it comes to an Eved, it would be okay to perform such a conversion. So others, Zimbalists in Eretz Yisrael, looked at the Beis Yosef and said, yeah, well, an Eved case is different because an Eved doesn't require das. You don't need the same level of volition when it comes to an Eved. But Rav Shlomo Amar wrote a tshuva, and the Lev Aryeh of Grossness wrote a tshuva saying the Beis Yosef doesn't say that the distinction in terms of whether it's a person's an Eved or a non-Eved. Beis Yosef seems to indicate the distinction is the person going to be under the auspices of like a parent who's going to supervise them and look after them at the time. And if that's the case, then it seems like it would be okay, even with a non-Eved, if you're dealing with a cheresh or a shayta. So this was a very serious shayla, and we felt very bad for this man who was becoming like a Baal Tshuva and wanted to raise his daughter as Jewish, and the whole situation, even the woman that he had the child with was in the process of converting herself so that she could, end up marrying this man and raising this child, and God willing, have more children maybe in the future. So I went to Eretz Yisrael. This was this summer, I think, before COVID hit, and remembering Rabbi Schwartz's special sensitivity to always try to advocate, for people whenever appropriate. So I met with Rosh Shlomo. I didn't even know at the time he had written a tshuva. He showed me that he wrote a tshuva on this subject. I met with Rosh Shlomo Amar. I met with Rav David Lau, and they both, the Ashkenazic chief rabbi. Rav Amar, of course, is the former Sephardic chief rabbi, now the Sephardic chief rabbi of Yerushalayim. And they both felt that because here you had the additional advantage of not only was it somebody who'd be under the auspices of a parent, but she was also still a katana. She was just barely a katana. She was going to be a katana for like another 2 months. She was still a ketana. And in general, we say the katan mapilin also a das bezdin. Maybe you don't need a high level of das when it comes to a katan. A whole machlokes, whether that's only because the katan is eventually going to come to das. Plus, this person wasn't a textbook shoteh for sure, and wasn't a chayrish in terms of being a deaf mute, just had a limited level of cognition, but eventually she learned how to say a few brachos, she could do a few things. So on that basis, they felt that there was room to be meko, and I felt, very happy to come to that conclusion after, studying the sugya. And I have to admit, my own reading of the Beis Yosef was closer to Bamara's reading of the Beis Yosef than it was to Simbalis' reading of the Beis Yosef. So we felt comfortable that we had what to rely upon in this particular case. Well, Schwartz would also sometimes say that with some of the difficult shilos that were presented to him, particularly when it came to like transgender issues and things of that sort, he would say this is not something that he feels like he can handle. He can't deal with it. I remember reading in one of the svarim of I have a member of my mishpach of Yoel Schwartz who writes a lot of svarim in Eretz Yisrael. So he once quoted in one of his svarim of Chaskel Levenstein, who is the mashgiach of Panovich, as was saying as he got really, really old, I need kavar lo midor hazeh. This is I'm already out of this particular generation. So Schwartz was showing me some shilas that he got along these lines, and he said he can't really deal with this. But I took that to mean I am from this generation, so it's my job. I have to deal with this. So we dealt with also with a sense of sensitivity. We had one Gerus candidate who was a person who had undergone a sex change operation from male to female, and then he came back from female to male, and now he wanted to become a ger. We didn't have the issues of him acting out in a different gender. He was, acting out in the original gender that he was born in. So halakhically, that's obviously less problematic, but anatomically, he didn't have necessarily all of, the anatomy to go through a bris milah anymore. So the halacha is nichras agid. The person doesn't have the anatomy, it's actually not me'akiv. So we said that we could work with this person, even if we wouldn't be able to perform a bris milah. Anatomically, you can't perform the bris milah. So that was a kind of an interesting case. And we had another case that came along with a person who had the same-sex attraction. Could you work with them as a Gerus candidate? We once in our annual Gerus conferences at the GPS, we brought Dr. David Pelkovitz to give us a lecture about the subject, whether he felt that you could realistically work with such a candidate. And he said that he thought that as long as a person is prepared to take on Kabbalah Sol mitzvahs, including that particular mitzvah, so it'll be a challenge for the person, but they're willing to take it on. So he didn't think that it was an automatic disqualification. So we've tried, we had one case where we really, tried along those lines, but I learned it's a very challenging endeavor. It's a very challenging endeavor. Because when you ask a person, so are you prepared to take on this mitzvah as well? You have to understand whether you're coaching somebody, to maybe not be completely candid with you. And you have to, enable a person to feel completely comfortable that they will be candid. And based on the candid response, you figure out, whether or not you can proceed. But these are the challenges of our generation. We have challenges, but you have to deal with it. Rav Schwartz, dealt with the challenges that came, his way over many, many decades. Now we have, some of the same challenges. We have some new challenges, and we have to reckon ourselves to those challenges. We have to lispol also. You have to be able to bear the people. You have to be able to bear all of the burdens and all the problems, all the issues, and all the challenges that everyone else is bearing, and to be sensitive to that. When I wrote my Sefer Kan Yonah a few years ago, so I had a tshuva on the subject of Yibum Machalitza. I was speaking about some of the modern day challenges when it comes to Yibum Machalitza. So I wrote about what seemed to be a very, out of the box, question. A husband dies, we say, Uvein ein lo, ayin alav, right? You have to do your investigation to see if he left any children. If he left any children, then the wife is free to remarry. If he didn't, he left the brother. She has to do Yibum, either marry the brother or Chalitza, and they have the special shoe taking off ceremony when she moves the shoe from the Yom Spot. So in fact, just a couple of weeks ago in New York, when I was visiting in New York, we did 2 chalitzos. It doesn't come up that frequently, but it does come up over the years in the aftermath of the World Trade Center. We ended up doing 2 chalitzos, unfortunately, especially when men die young and don't have any children and they leave a brother. So you have to do a chalitza. So one question, sort of a modern day question, is: let's say that the husband didn't leave any children, but he left some zera. He and his wife were having reproductive difficulties, so they went through some sort of reproductive process where the husband donated some zera. They were trying to do in vitro fertilization and so forth. And the zera is still there. It was still cryovac. It was still frozen. And there's still a possibility a child could be born from that zera. You have a child born with either the widow or some other Jewish woman. So then it's going to be miyuchas potentially after the husband. We say that if the child is born at some future point in time, then the wife would be petura from chalitza or yibum. So Roshal Yisraeli wrote about this sort of in a theoretical way. He wrote about this a number of years ago. And he said that he thinks that it's no longer attributable to the husband if the zera was not inside of a woman's body, it wasn't inside of somebody's womb at the time of his death. Then he didn't feel that there would be an adequate connection. It's based in part on a tshuva the Noda Yehuda, who said that if the zera was inside of the woman, but it wasn't fertilized until 3 days after the husband died, so he thought that there's a possible argument that would not pater her from chalitza or yibum. So he extended that. He said maybe that's not true in the case where it's already inside the woman, but if it's just sitting around and hasn't even gone inside yet, so maybe that wouldn't be attributable to the husband, and therefore she would still be subject to chalitza and she could still perform yibum and not worry about it. But Rav Nassan Gestetner, who was, I think, the Mechaber of the Hovas Nassan, he wrote a tshuva at the end of the Sefer Chalitza Ke'ochasa. He disagreed. He said, no, the whole idea of Yibum Chalitza is that it's only applicable when you don't have an erasure, when you have an erasure of the late husband's name, Israel. But here it's you're not going to have a Michoy Shemo. You're not going to have a wiping out of the name if there is a child that's eventually born from the zera of this individual, and therefore he felt that would eventually exempt the woman from Yibum, but it also would create a problem if she would get married to the Yavam before this would occur. So I wrote in my sefer that I thought that it would make sense that the second opinion I thought made sense. That you can argue that the zera should pater the woman from yibum or chalitza as the case may be, but I brought the different shitas. But then in a footnote, I noted that El Yashiv in his Kovetz Chuvos actually wrote that it creates a bigger problem because a woman can't do chalitza. And you'll say, okay, it will pater the woman, but let her do chalitza just to be on the safe side. So you figure that would be okay. You cover all bases. She's done chalitza anyway with the brother. So he said, no, if the zera is still out there, if his sperm is still available somewhere, so then since that could come to impregnate a woman at any point in time, that's considered to be a chalitza muberes. It's like I have a pregnant wife who's out there somewhere. If you have a pregnant wife, it could even be a co-wife. So if you have multiple wives, so all of them are not able to perform chalitza at that point in time. So too, he felt that any chalitza and the chalitza would be invalid. The way that we paskin like Reish Lakish, so he felt that it would actually be a potential invalid chalitza. Now it turns out that Rabbi Yashiv only said this misapik because he wanted to discourage people from donating to sperm banks. So he gave all kinds of different reasons why it's problematic. And in addition, if they wouldn't have any other children and he leave a wife, she wouldn't even be able to do chalitza. She'd be trapped because of the zera that's out there. But we actually had a couple of cases. Believe it or not, in the last few years at the best. And it makes sense because if you had a man who died young, so it stands to reason sometimes it's because he had certain medical issues that made it difficult to have children and where he may have donated some zera. So we did have these issues where we had the question, does the zera need to be destroyed? Or can you rely upon the assumption that if the zera is not inside of the woman's body already, it's mekusa maisa, so that's not considered to be a chalitza muberes. That's how Rosh Shlita has paskin, that he feels that at least it's far-fetched. It's far-fetched to consider it to be a chalitza muberes situation. But we've actually had these shilas that have arisen in the Bezdin in recent times. One of the chalitzos, unfortunately, involved a young man who died of COVID. We have to realize COVID has been absolutely, devastating to the entire world and to the entire Jewish world and to our communities, and it has affected not only older people but also younger people as well. So one was a young man who died of COVID. So we've had a lot of COVID shilos that the Bezdin has had to deal with within the past year. So one of the very interesting shilos was that in the early months, certainly the early weeks, first couple of months of the COVID epidemic, if a person was dying of COVID in a hospital, they weren't even allowing family members to attend. and they weren't necessarily allowing family members to go to the funeral altogether. In certain funeral homes, they insisted on just doing everything themselves. Nobody was allowed to come near. So the question was, if nobody from the family identified the mace, how did they know that the person really died? How could you allow the wife to remarry if you didn't have identification of the corpse? Mind-blowing shayla. Who would even think of such a shayla? So the Carlsberg Dayan, or Yitzchak Stein, wrote a whole tshuva about this, in which he went through the sugyas in Yevamos, the same sugyas we had to go through after the horrific World Trade Center catastrophe, in which he demonstrated you could rely upon the medical staff, that's uman lomaru umnase. You could rely upon the government, identification that this is the person who died, like the Sam Sofer says. You can often rely upon official governmental records that a person has died. And you can rely upon the Siman Muvak. The Gemara talks about relying upon ironclad identification signs, that every single person has a bracelet with their name that has to be worn up until the time that they die, and the burial only takes place if the bracelet is still there, and that would never be removed from one person and go to another person. But these were some of the unbelievable shilas that came to us. So Schwartz was always consulted by the local medical establishment whenever there were medical ethics shilas. So I was put on the medical advisory board of one of the local hospitals, and they called me up during the COVID crisis to ask for my opinion about the allocation of scarce life-saving resources in terms of the allocation of ventilators and the like. So I went over the sugyas with them that you can't, disattach a ventilator from, somebody if it's going to cause their death, even if you think it's going to be more viable if it's used for a younger person. And we had somebody right here in the CRC who was in such bad shape that I remember I gave my Shabbos Hagodol drasha. I came on Zoom, and I came not on Shabbos. And right after I finished the drasha, my wife said to me, "You got to get on this Tehillim call right away, because they're saying Tehillim for this kashrus coordinator from the CRC who's in such terrible shape. They changed his name." And then miraculously, he recovered. He now goes completely, he always identifies himself by his new name because, it stuck. That name worked, Baruch Hashem. So I said to the people at the time, this conversation took place maybe a couple of weeks afterwards. I said, he's an older fellow, would have been a prime example of somebody who would have taken off the ventilator and not given it to him in the first place. And I said, he would have taken the ventilator offered this person, it would have been murder, would have been an act of murder. Because this person, he has a Baruch Hashem, now he's viable, he has a viable family. I said, most of the rabbis who work here in the CRC, we're old rabbis, but we need all of them. So you can't distinguish between the old folks and the young folks. But these are some of the shilos that the CRC Bezdin was brought into, in part because Rabbi Schwartz was so respected that all the medical hospitals, all the medical establishments and authorities would always consult with Rabbi Schwartz. And finally, we also had our share of Choshen Mishpat shilos that came up of the local playgroups and the schools. So they turned to the CRC Bezdin. What should be their policy with respect to tuition, to charging tuition, if they're going to still give classes by Zoom. So I quoted for them that there's a machlokes in the Shulchan Aruch about if you have a malamed, a teacher who's not allowed to teach anymore because it's a makas medina. There's some giant pandemic, it could be an epidemic that prevents people from going to school. It could even be a gezerah that the government declared that nobody's allowed to teach Torah in schools anymore. So do you have to pay the malamed or not? So it sounds like the Ramah Paskins that if it's a makas medina, normally we say that the Baal Habayis gets off the hook whenever there's an unforeseen circumstance. But it's a makas medina, so everybody suffers. So there's no reason to punish the malamed more than the Baal Habayis. So the Baal Habayis has to pay. Sounds like the Ramah has to pay everything. It's how the Shach Paskins and the Gra and the Nesivas say, why shouldn't they have to pay anything? If you get off the hook, if the Baal Habayis, the teachers, obviously the school, the parents would get off the hook. If it would be a regular owner, so Kal V'chomer, they should get off the hook if there's a makas medina. And the Sma says what the Ramah probably meant is that it should be split, or at least what the Mordechai that he quoted probably meant is that it should be split 50-50. Achloku, there are various cases where we say if it's a pandemic, so everybody should have to suffer equally. So the Chassam Sofer had a case where they had to stop the schools when there was a war that broke out between France and Austria in the early 1800s, and he paskined that since there are these three different opinions, so as a pshara, he will take the middle opinion to pay 50%. But he said that he himself paid whatever workers he had hired. He paid them everything, but he told everybody else they should try to pay 50%. In this case, I said that the Shulchan Aruch talks about if you can cure the situation, they talk with takulos, that it could be cured by inventive and creative ways of continuing to provide the service. So that's noch better. That's the best thing. So I said, now you have Zoom. Baruch Hashem, HaKadosh Baruch Hu was hiktim before the market. He created Zoom. So everyone should be, particularly sensitive when it comes to maintaining our schools, our yeshiva institutions, especially if they're furnishing the services ayidei Zoom. That's something that should be adequate to maintain payment of tuition. And with the playgroups, we generally went along with some sort of a pshara. I had a case where there was a caterer, a wedding that was supposed to be catered. They had to cancel the wedding because of the new restrictions, and the caterer had gotten a full payment of everything and didn't want to return anything. I said, that's not the halacha. You're not able to provide the services. You don't get to return it. You don't get to keep the money without returning it. You have to return the money. So the Piskei Tshuva talks about if there was a down payment that was intended to be non-refundable, so sometimes that doesn't have to be refunded. There's a Tosfos that talks about that. He said for reasonable costs, maybe that the caterer had already outlaid, they could keep a certain amount of money. We worked out a pshara. In this case, they were originally only going to return around 15%, so in the end they returned around 70%. I think that was what many of the Pesach programs did. Some of them returned 100%, but we had to work out psharas. Remember, Rabbi Willich Shlita said at the time that you should follow the example of what the Melech Stone said to Avam. He said, "Ten li hanefesh v'achush kach lach." Give me the people, and you can keep the money. So Rabbi Willich said the people should be happy just to have their good health, and they should be flexible when it comes to providing monetary compensation to workers who aren't able to work and things of that variety. Just be happy to attain li hanefesh. The main thing is tzalas nefashos, pikuach nefesh. I was zocha this past year to give a shiur for the RCA on the chiyuv to take vaccinations. Chiyuv is still in place. Anyone who hasn't taken them, whose children haven't taken the vaccinations, it's mamish to save everybody else, so we can have herd immunity, to make sure everybody gets vaccinations. Don't pay attention to the nonsense out there against vaccinations. It's a halakha imperative to take vaccinations. We had the zechus of having Rav Schwartz with us. Baruch Hashem, until he was active until his early 90s. He was nifter at the age of 95, and we mourn his loss. At the same time that we mourn his loss, we celebrate his legacy. As the Beis Din of America and the Beis Din here of the CRC continue to do the work that Rav Schwartz trailblazed for us, we're guided and we're strengthened by his example of compassion, erudition, strength, and above all, integrity. May we soon be zoche to see the fulfillment of Yeshayahu and Navi, V'ashiva shavtayach b'rishana, v'yotzayach kibatz chila, b'mheira b'yameinu.
Shakolach, thank you so very much for that wonderful tribute to Rav Schwartz, and just for a hike throughout all of the